The Union in Peril, the lead up to the Civil War. Senator John C. Calhoun was a sick man, too sick to deliver his speech to the Senate. On March 4th of 1850, Calhoun asked Senator James M. Mason of Virginia to read his speech for him. These are his words. I have senators believe for the first that the agitation of the subject of slavery would, if not prevented by some timely and effective measure, end in disunion. The agitation has been permitted to proceed until it has reached a period when it can no longer be disguised or denied that the Union is in danger. You have thus had forced upon you the greatest and the gravest question that can ever come under your consideration. How can the Union be preserved? As Senator Calhoun and other Southern legislators demanded the expansion of slavery, Northerners just as vehemently called for its abolition. Once again, the issue of slavery was deepening the gulf between the North and the South. Over the centuries, the northern and southern sections of the United States had developed into two really different cultural and economic regions. The distinction between North and South had its roots in the early 17th century when British colonists began settling Virginia in the south and Massachusetts in the north. Along with differences in geography and climate, the two regions were noticeably dissimilar in their religious and cultural traditions. However, it was the Southern dependence on the peculiar institution of slavery that really increased tensions between the regions and eventually brought them into conflict. The South, with its plantation economy, had come to rely on an enslaved labor force. In the North, with its diversified industries, were less dependent on slavery. As the North industrialized, Northern opposition to slavery grew more intense. The controversy over slavery only worsened as new territories and states were admitted to the Union. Supporters of slavery saw an opportunity to create more slave states, while opponents remained equally determined that slavery would not spread. The issue of slavery in California and its western territories led to really heated debates in the Hall of Congress and eventually led to a pretty fragile compromise. As the 31st Congress opened in December of 1849, the question of the statehood of California topped the agenda. Of equal concern, though, was the border dispute between the slave state of Texas and where the issue of slavery had not really been settled in the New Mexico territory, which was bordering that. As passions mounted, threats of Southern secession, the formal withdrawal of the state from the Union, became more and more frequent. Henry Clay tried to work out a compromise, but despite the efforts of Clay, the Senate rejected the proposed compromise just because the sectional conflict was too great. Tired, ill, and discouraged, Clay withdrew from the fight and left Washington. Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois picked up the pro-compromise reins, and Douglas unbundled the package of resolutions and reintroduced them one at a time, hoping to obtain a majority vote for each measure individually. The death of President Taylor aided Douglas's efforts, and Taylor's successor, Millard Fillmore, quickly made it clear that he supported compromise. At least in September, after 8 months of effort, the Compromise of 1850 became law, and for the moment, the crisis over slavery and territories had passed. However, the harsh terms of the Fugitive Slave Act, which was part of those compromises, surprised many people. Under the law, alleged fugitive slaves were not entitled to a trial by jury. In addition, anyone convicted of helping a fugitive was liable for a fine of $1,000 and imprisonment for up to 6 months. Infuriated by the Fugitive Slave Act, some Northerners resisted it by organizing vigilance committees to send endangered African Americans to safety in Canada. Others resorted to violence to rescue rescue fugitive slaves, and still others worked to help them escape. There was also no protection in the law for freed slaves to really fight on their own behalf. And so in some cases, freed African Americans were enslaved out of the North and returned to the South, although they'd never been slaves in the first place. Attempting to escape from slavery was really dangerous, and it meant traveling on foot at night without any sense of distance or direction, except for the North Star and other natural signs. It meant avoiding patrols of armed men on horseback and struggling through forests and crossing rivers. Often it meant going without food and water for days. As time went on, free African Americans and white abolitionists developed a secret network of people who would, at great risk to themselves, hide fugitive slaves. The system of escape routes that they used became known as the Underground Railroad. Conductors on the routes hid fugitives in secret tunnels and false cupboards and provided them with food and clothing and escorted or directed them to the next station along the way. Once fugitives reached the North, many chose to remain there, but others journeyed to Canada to be completely out of reach of their previous owners. One of the most famous conductors of the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. She was born a slave in Maryland in 1820 or 1821, and in 1849, after Tubman's owner died, she heard rumors that she was about to be sold, and fearing that, she decided to make a break for freedom. She succeeded in reaching Philadelphia. Shortly after passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, she resolved to become a conductor on the Underground Railroad. In all, she made about 19 trips back to the South and is said to have helped about 300 slaves, including her own parents, flee to freedom. Meanwhile, another woman brought the horrors of slavery into the homes of a great many Americans. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which stressed that slavery was not just a political contest, but also a great moral struggle. As a young girl, Stowe had watched boats filled with people on their way to be sold at slave markets. Uncle Tom's Cabin expressed her lifetime hatred of slavery, and the book stirred Northern abolitionists to increase their protests against the Fugitive Slave Act. While Southerners criticized the book as an attack on the South, the furor over Uncle Tom's Cabin had barely begun to settle when the issue of slavery in territories surfaced once again. The Compromise of 1850 had provided for popular sovereignty, which means the ability for states to vote for themselves, whether they wanted to be slave or free. To Senator Stephen Douglas, popular sovereignty seemed like an excellent way to decide whether slavery would be allowed in, for example, the Nebraska Territory. The only difficulty was that, unlike New Mexico and Utah, the Kansas and Nebraska Territory lay north of the Missouri Compromise line and therefore was legally closed to slavery. Douglas introduced a bill in Congress on January 23rd of 1854 that would divide the area into two territories, Nebraska in the north and Kansas in the south. If passed, the bill would repeal the Missouri Compromise and establish popular sovereignty for both territories. Congressional debate was bitter. Some Northern congressmen saw the bill as part of a plot to turn the territories into slave states, and Southerners strongly defended the proposed legislation, and after months of struggle, the Kansas-Nebraska Act finally became law in 1854. But the race for Kansas was on. Supporters and opponents of slavery attempted to populate Kansas quickly in order to win the vote on slavery in the territory. By March of 1855, Kansas had enough settlers to hold an election, and by however, thousands of these border ruffians from the slave states had crossed into Kansas, voted illegally, and won a fraudulent majority of the pro-slavery candidates. So a government was set up and promptly issued a series of pro-slavery acts. But furious over these events, abolitionists organized a rival government in the fall of 1855, and it wasn't long before there was bloody violence surfacing in this struggle for control of Kansas. Violence was not restricted to Kansas, though. In May, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered an impassioned speech in the Senate entitled The Crime Against Kansas. For 2 days, he verbally attacked the South and slavery, singling out Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina for his pro-slavery beliefs. Soon after, Butler's nephew, Congressman Preston Brooks, walked into the Senate chamber and struck Sumner on the head repeatedly with a cane until the cane broke. Sumner suffered brain damage and did not return to the Senate seat for more than 3 years. The widening gulf between the North and the South had reached implications for party politics as well. As the two regions grew further and further apart, the old national parties ruptured, new political parties emerged, and including a party for anti-slavery Northerners. All right, finally. By the time Abraham Lincoln is elected president, the Republicans, as the 1860 presidential election approached, the Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln. He appeared to be pretty moderate in his views. He'd pledged to halt the further spread of slavery, but he also tried to reassure Southerners that a Republican administration would not interfere with their slaves or with them. Nonetheless, many Southerners viewed him as an enemy. As the campaign developed, 3 major candidates besides Lincoln vied for the office, but the Democratic Party split over slavery, and Northern Democrats rallied behind Douglas and his doctrine of popular sovereignty, and Southern Democrats supported the Dred Scott decision, lined up behind John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. Anyway, there were others. The bottom line is Lincoln won, and Lincoln's victory convinced Southerners who had viewed the struggle over slavery part as a conflict between the states' rights and self-determination and federal government control, that they had lost their political voice in the national government. Some Southern states decided to act. South Carolina led the way. Seceding from the Union on December 20th of 1860, when the news reached the Northern-born William Tecumseh Sherman, superintendent of the Louisiana State Seminary of Learning and Military Academy, now LSU, he poured out his fears for the South. This is Sherman's words. "This country will be drenched in blood. The people of the North are not going to let this country be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. Besides, where are your men and appliances of war to contend against them? You're rushing into war with one of the most powerful, ingeniously mechanical, and determined people on earth right at your doors. Only in spirit and determination are you prepared for war. In all else, you are totally unprepared." And then he would go on, of course, to fight for the South and prove the point. Mississippi soon joined South Carolina's lead, as did Florida and Alabama and Georgia and Louisiana and Texas. And in February of 1861, delegates from the secessionist states met in Montgomery, Alabama, where they formed the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy. They drew up a constitution that closely resembled the United States Constitution, and they unanimously elected Jefferson Davis as the new leader. The North had heard the threats of secession before, but when it finally happened, no one was really shocked. But one key question remained in everybody's mind. Would the North allow the South to just leave the Union, or would they fight to preserve it? And of course, they fought to preserve it. So Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. And by the way, Jefferson Davis did not want this position at any point. Okay, Civil War will begin next time we get together.